Most business owners think personal liability begins when something goes wrong. In this episode, you're going to understand three things clearly. First, where liability actually begins in real-world institutional review. And second, why behavior matters more than filings. Third, how structure, when aligned properly through a trust, a holding entity, and an operating entity, changes how institutions interpret your patterns. This is not about theory. This is about how systems classify you when they have to decide whether your business is separate from you. By the end of this episode, you'll understand how behavior becomes pattern, how pattern becomes identity, and how identity determines where responsibility lives. Most business owners believe liability starts when something breaks, when a contract fails, when money is lost, when someone files a claim. But in reality, most institutional systems begin forming liability expectations when behavior becomes predictable. Not when conflict appears, not when money disappears, when behavior becomes repeatable. Imagine a founder in year one. They form an LLC. They open a bank account. They create branding. But then they personally negotiate every deal. They personally solve every dispute. They personally move money when something feels urgent. They personally step in to make sure it gets done right. It feels responsible. It feels like leadership. In actuality, it feels necessary. Nothing about it feels like structural risk. But repetition quietly changes how systems view that behavior. From an institutional perspective, and by institutions, I mean banks, courts, investors, underwriters, regulators, they view the repeated behavior and it becomes modeling data for them. If every major risk resolution depends on the one individual, the systems begin treating that individual as the operational endpoint. Not because the paperwork is invalid, not because the entity doesn't exist, but because predictability reduces uncertainty. And systems classify based on reduced uncertainty. Now, some of you are realizing right now that your business slows down when you step away. Some of you are realizing you never transferred real authority. You just created documents. Most people don't see this while everything is calm. They see it when something goes wrong. It feels like you're protecting your company. You believe you're temporarily stepping in until the system matures. It becomes routine. You're the one who signs, approves, negotiates, stabilizes. It feels efficient. It feels smart. But when pressure comes, institutions don't see temporary leadership. They see structural dependency. Documents only describe structure. Behavior demonstrates structure. Systems trust demonstration more than they trust description. You can file an LLC, but if your behavior never changes, the filing simply records that an entity exists. It doesn't prove separation. Let's look at two founders. Founder A forms an LLC and continues operating personally in every meaningful way. Founder B forms a trust first. That trust owns a holding company. That holding company owns the operating company. The operating company signs the contracts. The holding company controls ownership. The trust owns the holding company and establishes continuity beyond the individual. Founder B still works in the business, but major decisions route through a formal structure. Contracts bind the operating entity. Ownership and control are layered. And continuity exists beyond the founder's physical presence. Both founders filed documents, but only one changed behavioral structure. From a global institutional perspective, separation is not about labels. It's about whether the business can bind itself, act independently, and survive without collapsing into a single individual. When authority is layered, trust to holding company to operating entity, the behavior shifts. The founder is no longer directly absorbing risk. They're positioned above the operating risk layer. That changes the classification. That's separation. Some of you filed first and structured later. Some of you never structured beyond filing. And some of you are realizing structure is not formation. It's alignment. Filing feels like protection. Everything operates smoothly, so you assume protection is working. And then comes stress, which reveals whether structure was aligned or whether it was merely decorative. Liability signals form during the calm periods, not crisis, because calm behavior is reliable behavior. Picture 5 years of steady growth. No lawsuits, no major disputes, strong revenue. During that time, the founder personally guarantees 2 vendor contracts. They personally stabilize payroll during 1 tight quarter. They personally override a risky decision to protect the brand. Each decision feels isolated, but institutions don't store events emotionally. They store them as pattern entries. Systems ask one question repeatedly. If something fails tomorrow, who absorbs the impact? If the answer has been the same individual for 5 years, then classification forms. Trust to holding company, operating company alignment changes this dynamic because ownership risk lives in the holding layer, operational risk sits in the operating layer, and continuity risk sits in the trust layer. Behavior no longer routes directly to one individual. Now, some of you were protecting or believed that you were protecting the business. You were. But institutions may have been classifying you as the business. Intervention feels rare and responsible. But intervention becomes predictable. And predictability becomes structural identity. It becomes how the institutions see the business. Intentions are internal. Patterns are observable. Courts, banks, underwriters, regulators, they all classify observable behavior. Imagine an owner forms and intends full separation. They believe the entity protects them, but they personally negotiate the highest risk deals, personally inject capital when cash flow tightens, personally guarantee leases just this once. Each action feels rational, but repeated rational actions create structural signals. Institutions cannot measure your intent. They measure who binds the business, who stabilizes cash flow, who absorbs the final loss, and who resolves reversible decisions. That is structural authority. Now, you may have believed separation existed because documents said it did, but separation requires authority transfer and behavioral discipline. Intent feels protective. Behavior feels practical. But patterns become institutional memory. Behavior creates patterns. Patterns create expectation. And expectation creates classification. And here's the big one. Classification determines liability placement, where risk lives. This is not legal theory. This is how systems reduce uncertainty. And when a founder solves one crisis personally, then another, years later, when a major dispute arises, courts don't see intervention. They see history. They see dependency. They see classification. Systems are built to reward predictability. If you're the predictable endpoint of risk resolution, systems place risk expectations there on you. On the other hand, if structure creates layered independence, trust ownership, holding control, operating execution, then behavior shifts. Risk routing shifts. Classification shifts. Some of you are replaying moments that felt harmless. that discomfort is clarity forming. Exception becomes habit, and habit forms identity. Most business owners think liability begins when something goes wrong, but most systems begin forming liability expectations when behavior becomes predictable. During normal operations, during calm growth, during quiet intervention moments, structure is not paperwork. Structure is aligned behavior. If behavior never changes, classification never changes. And whenever classification consistently points, that is where institutions place responsibility. That is where behavior-based liability usually begins.